I really appreciate your hospitality, your warmth, and your interest in Barbara Jordan, a Black woman who was, I think, grossly often mischaracterized, and a politician whose achievements remain underappreciated. And these two aspects of Jordan's legacy are frequently kind of intertwined. Myths, both negative and positive, were created while she was alive, and I think continue to cloud her legacy. So Jordan's achievement as the first Black woman elected to Congress from the South is well known and I think appreciated. She served from 1973 to 1978 and retired because of MS. But she continued to teach and participate in party politics until her death in 1996. Now, Jordan was a private person, a lesbian, who lived her life with her partner, Nancy Earle, both in D.C. and in Austin, Texas. But I would say this was kind of an open secret, not very well known, certainly only recently admitted by her family members and people closest to her. Her public life, however, made her one of the best known figures in the late 20th century in the United States. Her fantastic oratory and her commitment to civil rights and to inclusion made her a star in the Democratic Party. And so today I want to talk about the roots of her political career, including her civil rights activism and her origins as a progressive Black politician in an era when conservative segregationists dominated the party apparatus in Texas and in her hometown of Houston. Today I'm going to talk about a little bit on little-known players, such as the women who spearheaded her organizing drives and engaged in party building, the Black church and labor leaders who supported her forays into politics, and the Black businessmen who eschewed her belief in coalition politics. This paper really asks you to question some misleading narratives surrounding Jordan's success as a national figure and to reconsider what her electoral breakthroughs meant for reconfiguring the Democratic Party in the South. So most recently, the death of Jesse Jackson, I think, brought the question to my mind of Jordan's significance in sharp relief. They were born 5 years apart. They were pretty much the same generation, and Jackson's death prompted an outpouring of commemoration and reflection, rightfully so, on his significance. His presidential campaigns in the 80s brought a new generation of Black voters into the Democratic Party, gave a new name, the Rainbow Coalition, to older alliances, and furthermore, his convention speeches in particular reintroduced powerful oratory into the DNC. And he became the first Black candidate to ever win a presidential primary in a state. So according to most obituaries, it was Jackson who embodied the continuity between the civil rights movement and electoral politics. But whither the previous wave of Black elected officials who emerged in the 60s and 70s and during the civil rights era? You have people like, of course, Andrew Young, Julian Bond, Shirley Chisholm, Bill Clay, and yes, Barbara Jordan. And this entire pre-Reagan cohort, but I think especially Jordan, inspired Black voters to join the Democrats, and they too forged coalitions with organized labor and minority groups, and they helped to create new race-based organizations such as the Congressional Black Caucus and the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies at Howard Universities, all of these organizations dedicated to Black advancement. And it was this generation, I think, that laid the foundation for what we now call the quote-unquote Black vote, and established the Democratic Party as the instrument for turning the ideals of the movement into reality. And because of his close ties to Dr. King, it's easy to associate Jackson with the civil rights movement, but perhaps less so with Barbara Jordan. But well before the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, Jordan emerged as a political force in Houston. As a young woman, she organized Black voter registration drives, organized against school segregation, revitalized the NAACP, and participated in the Democratic Coalition, a group of Latino, Black, liberal, and labor organizers and activists who sought to overturn the conservative control of the state's Democratic Party. She broke through barriers of racism and sexism to become a successful Black candidate and Black leader, the first Black woman ever to win a primary race in Texas. And while in Congress, she played a pivotal role in the impeachment of Richard Nixon, the successful renewal and expansion of the Voting Rights Act in 1975, And after receiving 23 standing ovations during her address to the DNC in Madison Square Garden in 1976, Jordan was hailed as the, quote, hero of the Democratic Party, and went out to use her powers of persuasion and oratory to support the party and its successful candidate, Jimmy Carter. Consistently named in polls as the woman most Americans could see as president, Jordan seemed to have an unlimited future in politics, but ill health forced her to resign from Congress, and she died in 1996 at the age of 59, active to the end of her life in politics and in service. While she served, though, liberals were sometimes perceived Jordan as a conservative, someone who colluded with conservatives, the other side of the Democratic Party, and that she did so, furthermore, because of her own somewhat distasteful and excessive personal ambition. Not because she was dedicated to civil rights, but because she was dedicated to herself. This is one of the myths that I'm talking about. For example, her 1979 autobiography entitled Self-Portrait received pretty lukewarm and negative reviews when this came out in 1979. So I'm going to read some things that you might find disturbing, but they were said. Jordan's book proves, quote, how little she accomplished, remarked Thomas Nocera in the Washington Monthly. Black historian Alton Hornsby didn't think Jordan did much for the black struggle. Jordan seemed more devoted to the question of women's rights than to race, he wrote. Kay Northcutt of the liberal Texas Observer, in a review, this was in the Sunday New York Times, suggested that Jordan cultivated relationships with white elites for personal gain, and that she still might be angling for a political comeback. Then again, Northcutt wrote, it's hard to imagine that Barbara Jordan, the pragmatist, could harbor any hope that a big, black, lame, single woman could land one of the nation's most important offices. Molly Ivins defeminized Jordan consistently in many of her comments, called her cozy as a pile driver. So this is a common kind of racist tactic to defeminize, black women. She was often called, her weight was often mentioned in press releases. Journalists called her things like hulking. Her weight was a common topic. Even after her triumphant 1976 keynote address to the DNC, this is very disturbing. Journalists called her Aunt Jemima. Mammy came up. The black-owned Los Angeles Sentinel described her as, quote, not particularly physically attractive in accordance with Western standards. When she first ran for office, a political scientist told her, you're black, you're a woman, and you're large. People don't really like that image. She was shocked by this statement. This was 1962, but she ran anyway. And those stereotypes fueled by racism, sexism, ableism, and then homophobia never really went away. These negatives, however, must be contrasted with sort of very opposite, but almost like heroic images of Jordan as a great American and the embodiment of the American dream. So you can see this is a cover of another book about her. But she is literally here wrapped in the American flag. So all of her criticisms of American racism and the American practice seem to kind of disappear in this depiction of her. She's almost depicted as sort of a race neutral, or race blind, color blind, gender blind. Even in this picture, her wheelchair is hidden. She's kind of floating, but you can't even see her wheelchair in this photo. She's really depicted here often as sort of an adherent of American exceptionalism and a great patriot. But it's this sort of curious combination of admirers from conservatives who's like, well, she's not really, she's black, but not really, right? Like, she's just a great American. Her blackness, her womanhood, her sexuality, even her disability get erased under the cover of the American flag. She's simply a great American patriot, right, and hero. And she's buried next to Stephen F. Austin in the Texas State Cemetery, in Austin. And up until recently was the only black person buried in that cemetery. So, like, still breaking racial boundaries, but in a way she's kind of like an honorary, it's just, I think it's very strange. So both of these perspectives, kind of the overly heroic and the negative, I think misunderstand and misconstrue Jordan. And I would argue that she does belong in this pantheon, right, of Black freedom movement leaders and solidly in the Black Southern tradition of insurgency. After all, before she testified against the nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, Jordan said, "My opposition to this nomination is really a result of living 51 years as a Black American, born in the South and determined to be heard by the majority community." So why is it so difficult to, quote, see this fundamental truth, I think, about Jordan? Partly because at times she didn't want you to. She was a clever politician, but she was more than just pragmatic. I would call her a strategic idealist. She spent 6 years in the Texas Senate learning about the nuts and bolts of governance and deal making. And when she went to Congress, she did often position herself to the white establishment within her own party as someone reasonable. But she always stood with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and stated her position with candor. She understood that conservatives were part of the political landscape of America and part of the Democratic Party. There's no getting away from that. And they often, though, chaired committees, and they were powerful individuals. But at the same time, they were starting to recognize the strength of the emerging Black vote, and Jordan was perceived as an important broker of that vote. So as someone who understood what it meant to be subjected to power, Jordan understood why it was important to exercise power when you have it and build relationships to gain it. Her strength was her voice, her moral authority, and the Black voters behind her. As she addressed an overwhelmingly Black crowd at the Texas State Capitol in 1973, she said to the crowd, "I want you to stand behind me and help me move this state. Stand behind me and help me move this nation." So, one incident in particular that cemented Jordan's reputation among Texas liberals as a sort of a backroom conservative who couldn't be trusted was her testimony in support of John Connally at his DC bribery trial in the spring of 1975. How could she, right? Where could there be a more obvious example of someone who was just playing up to the rich, the powerful, and, forgive me, but the horrible, right? So Connally had actually switched parties. He was a conservative Democrat, and then he went over and he joined the Nixon administration. And he had served under Nixon as the Treasury Secretary. And everyone kind of knew he was corrupt. Everyone I talked to said, "Oh yeah, we knew he handed out like walking around money, and this was just part of what you did." But she did agree to testify as a character witness at this trial. And this was important because this was in DC, it's an all-Black jury. She was not the only one. Billy Graham also testified, on John Connally's behalf. But he was acquitted. But people just said, "How could you do that?" And it was just another example of her bending the knee to please the powerful. And I agree, you kind of wonder, why did she do that? Okay, but in order to understand the why, I think it's important to go flashback. Let's go back 13 years to 1962, when John Connally was running for governor of Texas and Jordan was running for her first seat in the Texas House. Okay, so here she is, 1962. She's 26 years old in this picture. She's a 1959 graduate of Boston University Law School. She had passed the Texas bar and the Massachusetts bar when she was 23 years old. In 1960, then she comes back to Houston and she joined local efforts on behalf of the Kennedy campaign for president. And Kennedy did win in Texas. He won. Kennedy won Texas. So these voter registration drives mattered. So this is Houston. And in the waters of Black politics in 1962, Jordan is really still a tiny little fish in a big pond. Now, the American hero myth suggests that Jordan just kind of dropped from the sky. It's like, oh, this amazing politician, she worked hard, she ate her vegetables, she got all A's, as though there were no one else, right, who was ever brilliant or qualified, somehow it's just her. But politics doesn't work that way, right? You need a base, and you need voters. Like, how are you going to get elected without voters? So what is important to understand, which I go into in detail in my book, is sort of the history of Black Houston and voting, and how that base had emerged actually before, when she was just a child. Black people had been voting in the Democratic primaries in Texas since the 1940s, when a Houston plaintiff, Dr. Lonnie Smith, a dentist who belonged to Jordan's church, triumphed in a very important Supreme Court case called Smith v. Allwright, a case that overturned the white primary. So up until 1944, Black people couldn't even join the Democratic Party in Texas. It was against the law. So they couldn't even vote in in primaries to nominate a candidate. So that changed with this court case in 1944, and one of the key figures behind that was this gentleman, the Reverend Albert A. Lucas, who I think was a great unsung hero of the civil rights movement. It was his organizing. He worked closely with Thurgood Marshall. He was president of the local and then the statewide NAACP chapter in Texas. And he found the plaintiff, Dr. Smith, who was his member of his church, and led this organizing drive in Texas. I mean, there were many people involved, many people. But Lucas, as a minister, was a very persuasive speaker and totally committed to the civil rights cause. So long before Montgomery, the Black churches in Texas were places of political education and political organizing. And here you see this quote from an NAACP leader who came down to Texas to organize there, where he says, "I'm telling my friends of the two-fisted Houston preacher who on the last day of the campaign had NAACP memberships lying beside his Bible on his pulpit, symbolizing the fact that he places the physical welfare of his people beside their spiritual salvation." So it was Lucas who really explained to people about the importance of voting, the importance of giving money. These are working class folks, right, in his congregation, to end the white primary, and it works. And so by the early 1960s, you had Black precinct leaders in Houston. These are people who count the votes. They're Black, right? You had Black registration that had shot up from nothing, from 5% to nearly 40%. Now, Houston also had a relatively wealthy Black business class. These are men who own taxi services, banks, small banks, but they're still banks, okay? Beer distributions, they're beer distributors and more. And it was these sort of elite businessmen who serve as the stewards and the so-called race leaders. And these guys, they're pretty skeptical of white liberals. And this goes back to Merlene Petrie's book on the NAACP executive director Lulu White and Reverend Lucas, who had actually joined forces with white liberals and white labor leaders in this white primary, in this lawsuit to overturn the white primary. But these Black businessmen by the 1960s were really solidly behind John Conley in his race for the governor. Why? Well, he had an economic plan. They weren't especially bothered by his opposition to the civil rights movement. Integration is happening, it's happening slowly. Many of these Black businessmen, they're businessmen. And Conley is promising them, a way into his administration. He said, "I've got a new vision, and you're part of it." And he's reaching out to this Black business community. The 60s had removed some of the odious segregation laws in transportation. School segregation is proceeding slowly. And also, come on guys, Conley's gonna win, okay? So Conley was aligned with white elites. He's clearly gonna win. He's reaching out to the Black vote. What have we got to lose by endorsing him, right? It seemed a foregone conclusion. So there's a sort of umbrella organization of Black institutions and smaller organizations called the Harris County Council of Organizations, called the HCCO. And this group is organized enough that they have a set of bylaws that said they could endorse a candidate if they got 2/3 support of delegates present. So in 1962, they meet in a local Black YMCA and they debate who to endorse. And 75 delegates, you need 60. And the choices were Conley, a conservative, and a liberal World War II veteran and lawyer by the name of Don Yarborough, who positioned himself as like a young Kennedy, right? So the black newspaper Forward Times said, frankly, the best organized forces on the floor were the John Connally supporters. Now, Jordan, though, had been young. She was an early supporter of Kennedy, and she had worked with the Texas liberals in that race to bring out the black vote in 1960. One witness says, she'd go into a black church, give one of those speeches, and we'd have volunteers running out of there, people volunteering to be registration clerks. The results were phenomenal. And after that experience, Jordan stuck with the liberals and really was part of this effort to undermine the conservative grip on the Democratic Party in Texas. And on that afternoon, in that YMCA, something remarkable happened. Barbara Jordan rose and gave a stirring speech on Yarborough's behalf. And the newspaper said, this was a dramatic moment. Most dramatic yet is Miss Barbara Jordan's attachment to the liberal slate of candidates. And the result was neither candidate got the required 2/3 vote. All right? Connally lost the black endorsement. And now the black vote was up for grabs. And he won the governorship, but liberals made inroads into the legislature because black voters went for the liberals. And Jordan had made an enemy. So what this indicates is a very young woman. Jordan was emerging as a voice of progressive black leadership. And this was just something starting, and black voters trust her. Unions trust her. Churches trust her. Older people who had been voting since the 1940s and 50s trust her. They like her education. They like her militancy. They like her speaking style. They love her womanhood. Black women are all for her. Okay. And this is going to be really important as she seeks to build a base and a campaign structure that's going to get her elected. So in the next few years, Jordan continues to run for office, but the odds are against her. So you have black voters, but black politicians? You got 72 of them in the whole South. In the whole South. In 1960, there was not a single member, a black member of any southern state legislature. 0. Okay. That was disfranchisement. All right. So, what do you do? Okay. Well, and you also have poll taxes. There's all kinds of ways to disfranchise people, right? Besides just registration. That's just the beginning. There's poll taxes. There's high bonds required to run for office. In Houston, you have multi-member districts. Dr. Gillespie can explain all this in much greater detail than I can, but for state legislative seats. So it's really impossible. You know, you're running in a district of 1 million people, you're a black candidate. Even if every single black person votes for you, you're not gonna win. And so this is an example of how voting power was diluted. This is the, voting through male apportioned districts, also that favored rural over urban voters, etc. But Jordan continued to run for office, and each time she attracted more voters, and she continued her activism. She revived the local NAACP, worked with local leaders on school integration, gave speech after speech against segregation, led the Houston drive to overturn the poll tax in a statewide referendum. It failed, but again, it brought more people into the cause. Traveled the nation, gave speeches all over. Her reputation as a speaker was growing. She would often be invited to go to Louisiana or Chicago to give speeches. In Blue Texas, Max Crocknell called this movement the Democratic Coalition, this alliance of labor, liberals, black and Latino voters that is trying to gain momentum and wrest control of the party and win some seats in the Texas legislature. And they do, white liberals do, but not black candidates, right? So that you have, in a weird strength, you have a one-party system in Texas, but it's increasingly split. So it's kind of a two-party system within that one party. It's very interesting. And Jordan continues to lose in 62 and 64. She is the victim of at-large voting where liberal and conservative candidates within the Democratic Party run against each other, and some liberals win, but they're white, not her. So she's getting very frustrated. These rules are not fair, and how come these white people aren't voting for me, right? I'm bringing in lots of black voters to vote for liberal white folks. I've been doing this since 1962, right? How come white people aren't voting for me? But then there's a series of court cases based on Baker v. Carr and other achievements. This is before the Voting Rights Act, that determined that single-member seats in the Texas Senate were unfairly drawn, and that Houston, with 1 million people, deserved 4 seats in the Senate, not 1. So new lines were drawn, and the new 11th district had precincts in neighborhoods where Barbara Jordan had grown up and that she had previously won in 62 and 64. Not enough to get her into the to get her into the House at large, but with a single-member district, she could win. All right. Given all of her work for the coalition, she seemed to be the logical choice. But even though the coalition welcomed black voters, it was far more skeptical of black candidates. And Jordan was challenged by a white liberal labor lawyer who actually said to black voters that it was racist for blacks not to vote for him. They said, "You're being racist. I'm a victim of racism." All right. So grassroots organizing, Jordan said, "No, I'm gonna run against this guy in the primary." And grassroots organizing, block worker campaigns swung into action because you want to attract the white vote, but we can't trust it. So what we have to do is get out more black people than ever before. And this lady here did it for her. Dr. Wilhelmina Elaine Perry, again, another unsung hero of this movement. She was the first black woman to receive a PhD in sociology at UT Austin. She taught sociology at Texas Southern. Her PhD was on politics, and she really worked with Jordan on creating this so-called block worker campaign. How do you get people to go door to door? How do you educate people about how to use a voting machine, right? People don't know. They're uncertain. And how do you organize an office, right? How do you get out the vote? So she put her headquarters in the 5th Ward and then she also had mentees. These 2 women, who were partners, by the way, Cecile Harrison and Alice Lane, they were also PhD students in sociology, and they became completely dedicated to Barbara Jordan and to politics in Houston. So they put her campaign headquarters on Lyons Avenue, and these local women organized the office, and then they organized local women. These are housewives, domestic workers, working class people. But, I want to say these are people who had been involved in local community politics, but now they're energized because they have a candidate. They've really got someone to work for. Now, again, but Bayard Rustin, if you remember, wrote this article from Protest to Politics, who said, hey, look, we've got to start participating in primary races, but he kind of leaves out a few crucial details, like how are you going to raise money? How are you going to get out the vote, right? How are you going to register voters and educate voters? How are you going to organize a campaign? These women had to create all that, almost from scratch, right? And I think of it as sort of like community institution building. Like black women have been doing this institution building for generations, and now they're doing it in politics. Only we call it like getting out the vote. But really what they're doing is they're remaking the Democratic Party in the South, all right? So, and giving Jordan a base. So Jordan did get some white votes, but she gained more black votes of any candidate who ran in this series of races. And it turned out she only needed 11 white votes to win. But she got many more than that, but she only needed 11. The black turnout was so strong for her. So Jordan was the first, here she is. She's just won. Look how young she looked, There she is, 1966. She was the first black woman to win a primary race in Texas. Took her stand as a leader, someone who could command black voters, bring them into the fold, and someone who won. See, this is really important. She's a winner. Like, black people can win. She proved it, okay? And that was not a given at all at the time, all right? So when Jordan, though, went to the Texas Senate under Governor Connolly, Now, I know this looks bad. Like, there she is, like, second from the row from the bottom. These are the 31 other members of the Texas Senate. But what you also have to remember is that there's a sizable group here. It's tempting, in other words, to say, of liberals, sizable group of liberals. So it's tempting to say, oh, it's 30 against 1. But not exactly, because she's been part of this coalition. And because of these court cases and lawsuits and things, actually you have a 12, 13, 14 so-called liberals. These are people who are for economic justice and racial justice. And suddenly, like, hey, they can do things now in the Senate that they couldn't do before. And there's a lot of hope. But, you know, and Jordan from the start speaks out against Connally. I just want you to know how much she hates him, okay? The governor may have his way in the Texas House, but not in the Senate. And she promised to dissent where dissent is called for. You know, but of course, the liberals, what do? They mess it up, okay? They can't, and this isn't like black and white. These are white people. They cannot always agree and do, you know, people say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote for that. And then in the end, like, someone twists their, you know. So they almost got a corporate income tax through. Almost. No. One vote. It was like 16 to 15. And so things like that happen. But throughout her 6 years in the Senate, her enmity towards Connally only grows. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, she heard him say that he deserved it. I mean, Connally actually said that. And she later on denounced him for saying that. He blocked her rise within the state executive committee. He refused to invite her to the governor's mansion. He really treated her with great rudeness and discourtesy. And oral histories with other white liberals confirm this. Now, Connally then leaves office and becomes a Republican and joins the Nixon administration, but he remains friendly with Southern Democrats, including President Johnson, his good friend, and white conservatives who would sort of now are shifting a bit, but they're still conservatives, like Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Those two are so close that Connally asked him if Byrd would consider a nomination to the Supreme Court, but Byrd said no. We'll come back to this later. Jordan, meanwhile, solidified her base in her largely positive relationship with Lyndon Johnson. And the 1970 census meant that the Senate could redraw the legislative districts, and it was Jordan herself who drew the contours of the 18th Congressional District. This was a new district, still exists, up until, well, we'll see tomorrow. Those lines hadn't changed since she drew them. And she's on her way to Congress. All right. So I go into a lot more detail of this in the book, because again, this was a huge fight, big battle to get to Congress, but she does it. So when she enters Congress in 1973, she does so, as I said, with the largest number of black representatives since Reconstruction. And initially, she took many kind of, you could say, radical stances and postures. She initially acted and spoke out against the Democratic Party establishment. Carl Albert takes them to task, like, you've got the majority. How are you letting Nixon push you around like this? Because Congress had passed bills to spend money. Nixon was refusing to spend it. She was elected as spokesperson for the freshman class. She spoke very forthrightly as a black feminist to the National Urban League, where she basically says to black men, you are mistaking sexual prowess with power. Doesn't work that way. I mean, she is just bold. She says this at a meet with thousands of people present. And more importantly, equally important, she had been calling for Nixon's impeachment almost as soon as she arrived in Congress. When news of the Saturday Night Massacre, the firing of Archibald Cox, emerged in September of '73, Jordan issued a press statement calling for Nixon's impeachment, because she said, we're not ruled by kings, we're ruled by law. So this was a very, I don't want to say like happy, like a freeing time for her. There she is with Andy Young. Here she is playing poker and having, and that's not a good picture. I've got a better one, but that's Nancy Earl there. Her back is to the camera there, but they are kind of, I don't want to say enjoying themselves, but it's very freeing actually to be among these in this context of DC with other black leaders, etc. And then during the Watergate hearings, however, things get more serious. And she kind of shifts gears a little bit. And again, you can read into this a little bit more deeply, but she becomes a voice of so-called moderation. And I think it's very interesting that until the night of her famous speech calling for the impeachment of Nixon, suddenly she's considered an undecided voter. I mean, no one, really? You don't think she's going to vote to impeach Nixon? But she was whenever she was asked, she'd say, well, we have to look at all the evidence. I don't think I'm persuaded yet. And there's reasons why she's doing that, and she's doing it to persuade the undecideds. She is constantly in conversation with the undecideds. And she knows that if people know how you're going to vote, they stop talking to you. They do. Why should they? It's withholding that gives you power, all right? So after Watergate, and we can hopefully talk about this in question and answer time, Jordan then became the most well-known black politician in the nation. And at a mini-party convention in Kansas City in early 1975, she was singled out as, quote, the most charismatic figure in the Democratic Party. And, Ted Kennedy spoke at this, right? Her, quote, cold outrage at corruption and her clarity of expression made audiences stop and listen to what may be the most powerful speaking style since Adlai Stevenson restored elocution and intelligence to public oratory. This is what the Washington Post said. And as a sign of party unity, Jordan introduced Senate Whip Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Now Byrd, he's also clever. He's shifting a bit. He speaks to the convention and says, you know what? The Senate is going to act on a massive unemployment bill. We're going to cut taxes to low and middle income families, and I've got a plan for national health insurance. Robert Byrd, former member of the Ku Klux Klan, right, saying this. And Jordan praised him as an unmistakable leader who has shown great willingness to do what is difficult as well as what is right. And as they walked off the stage together, he said to Jordan, if there's anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to let me know. So after the debacle of Chicago in 1968 and the overwhelming loss to Nixon in 1972, the Democrats are like, can we please unite and get the presidency in 1976, right? So this is what is on the agenda. This is what everyone's thinking. So the party was seeking to show that liberals and conservative Democrats could unite, all right? But then the Wall Street Journal puts a different spin on this event. You think, okay, it's great, everyone's getting together. In a deceptively laudatory article on Jordan, the paper then advances the thesis that she is mainly a self-interested politician guided by her outsized ambition. It quoted her introduction of Senator Byrd as evidence that, quote, Jordan is a very ambitious politician who uses her eloquence not only on behalf of high principle, but also to get ahead. And what could be worse than an ambitious woman, black woman? Quote, a lot of her fans are wondering why Representative Jordan said all those nice things about Senator Byrd. After all, who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he had renounced that, etc. But he is certainly part of this older generation. There's no getting around that. It quoted friends, so-called unnamed friends, who called Jordan arrogant and noted her, quote, limitless ambition. Jokes with male colleagues. Now, she's very comfortable in an all-male environment. This goes back to being on the debate team, the only woman on the debate team. Suddenly, she's guilty of put-downs. And, this is it, Representative Jordan's inability to suffer fools may have something to do with her failure so far to get married. And this was in the Wall Street Journal. So these very petty, her inability to get married comes up a lot. So these very petty personal criticisms were very irritating to Jordan, and they also began to manifest in other disputes. After all, organized labor now is saying, well, hey, where's our place in this new Democratic Party? They feel put out by the growing demands of women, blacks, young people, and other minorities. Where does she stand on that issue? And now, a fissure threatened to form over the Voting Rights Act renewal. Most civil rights organizations rejected any plan that would expand the Voting Rights Act. After all, the law would expire in 6 months. It was renewed in 70, it's going to be renewed again in 75, and Clarence Mitchell, the chief lobbyist for the NAACP, worried that any major changes would provide a, quote, drawn-out battle that might endanger the law. Not an unfair assumption. So he favored a straightforward 5-year renewal, no changes. Mexican Americans, however, who had clearly suffered from racial and discrimination and abuse at the voting booth, wanted to be covered by the act. And the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights thought they should too. And so in the spring of 1975, the commission, headed by this woman, Frankie Freeman, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, endorsed a move to expand the 1965 Voting Rights Act to protect many more Spanish-speaking people. The commission produced evidence that Mexican-American candidates and their supporters had been subjected to intimidation and economic reprisals, and it recommended that the act be extended for another 10 years, not just 5, and that Congress ensure the right to vote of non-English speaking minority citizens. And this commission was headed by Jordan's good friend and fellow Delta Sigma Theta Soror, Frankie Freeman, okay, civil rights legend. Jordan had been wanting to bring Texas under the provisions of the Voting Rights Act and thought that she could do it. Okay. And the commission's framing empowered her to move forward with this plan. But to do that, then she had to introduce a bill which would extend coverage of the Voting Rights Act to the whole of Texas, parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And the trigger would be if less than 50% of those eligible voted, and if the registration materials are presented only in English, if at least 5% of the population had a mother tongue that wasn't English, then the act would be triggered. So inserting this quote-unquote language provision into the VRA was really arguing that the 15th Amendment included a broader definition of race beyond African Americans. This was not a given. It had to be argued. Latino activists have been arguing for voter protection for some time, but there was a feeling perhaps that, well, maybe we should do this separately, right? Like, how do you do that? The safe thing to do, especially under a Republican administration, was simply to keep things the same for the next 5 years. Now, there were many illustrious black leaders who supported Jordan and the expansion of this bill. Andy Young did, John Lewis, and many of them spoke on behalf of this bill and testified before Congress. But the word around the press table, according to black journalist Elfrida L. Madison, was that Jordan was one of the most brilliant persons in government. Because whenever she spoke, you had to listen. There was just no way around that. The bill moved along. Some wanted more protections, others wanted less. Clarence Mitchell still opposed changing the Voting Rights Act, as did William Raspberry of the Washington Post, very influential journalist. He painted supporters of the language provision as unrealistic and unwilling to acknowledge the dangers of sudden shifts in strategy. These were the pragmatists, these guys. These pragmatists favored a retreat from the language provision, but Jordan disagreed very firmly and joined forces with Latino representatives from California and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and a new consensus in favor of the language provision slowly emerged. Voting procedures in Texas would become subjected to oversight by the Justice Department under Section 5, but how are you going to get Texas representatives to vote for that? Well, Jordan went to each member of the Texas delegation one by one. And according to her aide, it went down something like this. All she was saying was, don't have a gut reaction, but if you try and debate me on this, I'm going to run all over you. And she got some very conservative Texans to vote for that bill, and that was quite an accomplishment. And it was at this crucial moment that Jordan was asked to testify as a character witness on John Connolly's behalf. Even though he had switched to the Republicans, his old friends in the Democratic Party establishment pressured her to do it, and she also had her own reasons, because she understood that in the eyes of conservatives and the businessmen, Her testimony would show her to be somebody who was fair and open, and she wanted their support. And she knew that Connolly and Robert Byrd were extremely close, and so she did it. Now, she also persuaded the Congressional Black Caucus to get on board, and there's evidence for this in the papers of the Congressional Black Caucus, because some were reluctant to do it. But finally, the House Judiciary Committee voted 27-7 in favor for the language provision, and when the bill went before the full House, many people, I mean, it's not just her, but many people gave powerful speeches defending the legislation, fought off opponents. People are always saying, okay, you can do this for other, but Virginia needs a bailout, or Alabama needs a bailout. Right? No, there were no bailout provisions in this. So after 13 days of hearings, 48 witnesses, the House passes the extension. But the Voting Rights Act is due to expire August 6th, and it's still got to get through the Senate. And Senator Eastland is chair of the Judiciary Committee. Okay, so the Civil Rights Subcommittee in the Senate held hearings when Eastland would not. But still, time is dragging. And Eastland finally calls a meeting of the entire committee to consider the bill, but the conservatives on it, and there's a lot, like Strom Thurmond, they try to stall it. People on the committee protest. So these are the senators now battling it out. And they say to Strom Thurmond, we could have the bill called up on the House floor anytime, on the Senate floor anytime. We don't have to wait for you. But Thurmond was so angry, he said, do it and see what happens. These guys they're not giving up. They're wily, they're not giving up. So tempers cool, the committee approved the bill, now it goes to the floor of the Senate. And here's where Byrd, the master of the Senate rules, worked his magic. He, quote, filed a debate-limiting cloture petition on it, preventing a filibuster, by limiting each senator to 1 hour of debate. That was the condition of the bill coming to the floor. And during an unusual Saturday session, he refused to give up the floor, except for relatively short statements by others, and on the condition that he be recognized to speak again as soon as they had finished. He wanted to keep the floor away from conservative senators from Alabama and North Carolina for fear that they might demand a snap vote when many senators were absent, and then it would fail. So finally on the Saturday session, disperses because there's a lack of a quorum, but business has to resume on Monday. Now Byrd has the votes to support his cloture motion, which would eventually force a vote, because you can't filibuster for days and days. But Senator Allen from Alabama had one more move up his sleeve. He called for the Senate to vote on cloture for another bill. And if he had succeeded, the Senate would have spent days debating that proposal before getting back to the voting rights extension, and the Voting Rights Act would have expired. Byrd saved the day again, raising a point of order against Allen's motion, which was ruled out of order, and on July 22nd, the Senate began debating the merits of the legislation. Byrd said, okay, we'll compromise a little bit. Let's extend this bill with the language provision for 7 years, not 10. So this is why you have the 1982. It's like this weird, it's not 5, it's not 10, it's 7. Everyone said, okay, the House agrees. And less than a week remaining before expiring the 1975, these are all the things that it did, and definitely includes Texas under Section 5. There's Robert Byrd, the junior whip, the man who runs the Senate. And Ford added his signature in the Rose Garden on the 10th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And Jordan is seen here taking the cards that contain Ford's remarks. This was her bill. Her name isn't on it, but she wrote it. Jordan said, this was my very first big legislative victory, and I wanted a memento. Jordan's speech to the Democratic National Convention the following year, 1976, again brought her to the attention of the nation. In just 10 years, she had moved from a Texas primary victory, 10 years between 66 and 76, right, to the national stage. Her stellar reputation as an orator had led her to her skill as a legislator to be overlooked, I think. Through grit and strategy, Jordan resisted a mere pragmatism and turned the ideal into the real. She took a lot of personal risks to get the Voting Rights Act through, and her reputation suffered greatly because of her Conley testimony. But she ultimately prevailed in achieving a great victory that expanded the meaning of civil rights and voting rights and had enormous consequences for American democracy, as well as creating a legal foundation for some of those alliances that Jackson would later call the Rainbow Coalition. Barbara Jordan had very little institutional power. She never chaired a subcommittee, but she knew that her public acclaim from the Watergate crisis, along with the respect for the power of her intellect and her voice, along with the support of black voters, gave her a unique power in that moment that allowed her to put pressure on conservatives to support the legislation she cared most about, voting rights. After all, Robert Byrd was thinking about running for the presidency. He would want Barbara Jordan's support if he did that. What a winner must win, wrote Newsweek journal Meg Greenfield, is the consent of others, whether out of respect or admiration or political agreement or mere expediency to get something done. To get the machinery going at all, it is necessary first to elicit the cooperation, active or passive, freely or grudgingly given, of many other players. Great speeches are important, but are not sufficient for legislative victories. Gaining cooperation to support legislation took commitment, moral authority, persistent pressure, attention, and sacrifices. Throughout her life, Jordan worked not only for the right of minorities to vote, but also crucially, not just for the right to vote, but for that vote to be meaningful, and for minority candidates to have a fair opportunity to gain office and to be fully protected by the Constitution. She therefore worked to end all practices that militated against minority candidates, including at-large districting, English-only ballots, and the most obvious forms of economic, racist, and social intimidation. Such laws were essential to her vision of what the Constitution required if American democracy was to include and protect us all. But they were also essential for racial progress. Black Americans, she knew, needed a strong base, but they also needed allies. So expanding that foundation of federal protection that fueled coalitions was central to her vision of what the civil rights movement was all about. Jordan knew that conservatives were here to stay, but she also thought that Democrats, if they worked together, could still fulfill, quote, our national purpose to create and sustain a society in which all of us are equal. Thank you.